Hey guys, I'm Lee Morris with fstoppers.com. Today we're going to be comparing the Zhiyun Weebill 2 to the current king of gimbals, the DJI RS2. Alright guys, this is the third time I've made this video, and that's because as I have used these gimbals more and more, I have realized that there are a few little annoyances with each one of them. And I have watched and read so many reviews of both of these gimbals, but a lot of these issues that I've had, I haven't seen in any other review. So what I've decided to do is simplify this review a lot. I don't want to repeat stuff that's in every other review of either of these products. I just want to talk about what's most important to me in the way that I shoot, and you can decide for yourself which one of these gimbals is right for you. First of all, let me start out by saying that this really isn't a fair review because the Weebill 2 should be compared to the DJI RSC2, which is cheaper than the RS2. The RS2 is $850 as you see it right here. The Weebill 2 with the combo kit, which comes with this briefcase handle on the back here, is $650. So this costs $200 more. Keep that in mind when we start looking at some of these other specs here. The RS2 is lighter. It can also hold a heavier camera, and it has better battery life at the exact same time. And battery life is something that I haven't heard a lot of other reviewers talk about. Now the RS2 does have an internal battery, but the grip is removable, and if you want to buy a new grip with a new battery built in, they're $100 each. It's not cheap, but it is an option if you're going to be shooting a ton during the day. DJI says that this can get 12 hours of use on one battery charge. I don't have any jobs that require that much gimbal usage, but I have read online people saying that they get real world around 8 hours of use, which is incredible. Even if you're shooting a wedding all day long, there's no way you're gonna be holding this, using it non-stop for over 8 hours. So I think it should last a full day's shooting. The Weebill 2 claims 9 hours of battery life, but in real world situations, I am reading online people saying that it only lasts 3 to 4 hours, which is a massive problem for this gimbal because you can't replace the batteries. Both of these gimbals charge with USB-C that I love. If I could create my own perfect gimbal, it would have replaceable batteries that could also be charged with USB-C in the grip. I have some other gimbals that you have to remove the batteries and put them in a separate charger. I hate doing that. I definitely like just plugging in the gimbal itself. But in a jam, if I need that extra battery life, I like being able to have extra batteries in my bag. That doesn't work with either of these unless you want to buy the extra grips with the DJI. All right, let's talk about the overall design and dimensions of both of these. As you can probably tell, the RS2 is slightly larger than the Weebill 2. However, because the grip comes off of the RS2, this does pack down a little bit smaller, but you could also argue that it's more stuff that you have to take apart and more stuff that you could potentially forget. This gimbal comes apart in a lot of different ways and can be built in a lot of different ways with different types of gear and kits. This gimbal's a little bit more of what you see is what you get. This handle on the back can obviously come off. If I were to be shooting with this, I would definitely leave this briefcase handle on. This is what helps you get the low angles when you're shooting like this to the ground. Having this extra handle is a lifesaver. Now looking at the briefcase handle on the RS2, it comes with this metal handle which can be screwed into either side, which is nice. They give you the option there. But to actually get the working handle, you have to unscrew the stand from the bottom and then screw it into this arm here. That's fine until you need to set the gimbal down on the ground like I have it right now, and you can't. So if I were shooting with this gimbal often, I would definitely want an additional briefcase handle that I could always leave attached to this so that I don't have to constantly be moving the stand back and forth. The RS2 has a very common design with the thumbstick being directly in the center of the back of the gimbal, whereas the RS2 has a very interesting design that places it off center. You may actually prefer this if you're right-handed, however, if you're left-handed, this probably isn't the gimbal for you. The screen on the Weebill 2 is obviously better. It's more responsive, it's bigger, it's easier to navigate, and the fact that it's off to the side makes it much easier to see. When you add a briefcase handle to the screen on the RS2, it makes things much more difficult to see. One thing to consider though is how often are you really going to be looking at either of these screens? I mean, once you plug in your settings, usually you can put the screen away, and when you do twist the Weebill screen and put it back in place, it turns off to conserve battery life. When it comes to build quality, the DJI RS2 is one of the most impressively built pieces of kit that I own. I actually got this on loaner to do a review months ago. I never ended up having time to do the review, but I love the build quality of this gimbal so much that I decided to buy it Even though I don't use gimbals very often and I own like 4 of them, I was so impressed by the way this thing was built and the way that it had the carbon fiber and the way all the little buttons felt. It's just so well made that it really impressed me. The Weebill 2 is extremely nice as well, but when you compare these side by side, there's really not much of a comparison. The RS2 is much better built. Now, I love that the RS2 is made of carbon fiber, but carbon fiber is soft, and these lockers that loosen and lock these carriages in place so that you can balance everything out have to get really loose or really tight to lock everything down or allow them to move around. And these lockers here are actually geared locks. And when you think it's loose, it may not be loose enough. And when you think it's tight, it's still probably not tight enough. So when I first got this, I thought, oh, look at how nice and smooth all of this works because it's made of carbon fiber. But once I added a camera to this and added some weight to it, I realized that I had to loosen this up a lot more than I did the steel or aluminum gimbals that I've owned in the past. And then tightening it was the same thing. I had to keep tightening it more and more and more and more. Whereas with the metal gimbals, it's really just one lock and you're done. Okay, let's quickly talk about the mounting systems for both of these gimbals. I haven't seen anyone talk about this yet. And both of them appear to have the Manfrotto flat 500 series plates as a mounting system. However, after the biggest pain in my ass ever, I have realized that the DJI plate is like 1/4 of a millimeter different than this standard plate that we have been using for probably decades at this point. I don't know why DJI would have made a plate that looks identical, but is just so slightly different that you can't use standard Manfrotto plates with this system. It absolutely drives me crazy, and this is why. They do have this quick release plate built in, but I don't want to use that tripod plate. I don't have any tripod heads that use that plate. I want to use the 200 series Manfrotto plate. So basically, I have had to jerry-rig this ridiculous system where there's a carriage, and then there's a tripod plate with a carriage and a quick release plate. And then on top of that, I've got a receiving plate, and then on top of that, I can put my 200 series plate. It's ridiculous, but it does work, and it allows me to use one tripod plate for all of my gear. As you can see, the Weebill 2 actually accepts standard 500 series plates, which would allow me to add an additional receiver on top of this, and then the 200 plate on top of that. It saves me about 1 inch of space. So let's talk about the most important thing, stabilization. I took both of these gimbals outside and I shot at 75 millimeters to really exaggerate that jitter. I would probably never shoot with that long of a lens on a gimbal, but I really wanted to compare these gimbals side by side and see if there truly was one that was doing a better job of stabilizing the footage. For this first shot, I'm shooting on the RS2 with in-camera stabilization turned off. As you can see, the footage looks pretty good, but definitely we still got some jitter there. The RS2 also has this super smooth mode, which is supposed to make your footage even smoother. I turned that on for this next test. I couldn't really see much of a difference. For this next shot, I'm shooting with the Weebill 2 and the exact same camera. As you can see, we've got a lot of jitters here. I don't know what was going on. It was very windy outside. I was worried that maybe I did something wrong. But I came back inside and did a test inside as well, and I still saw some of those jitters on the Weebill 2 that I was not seeing on the RS2. Now for the final test, I shot on both gimbals and I turned on camera stabilization, which is how I always shoot with a gimbal anyway. And as you can see here, the footage looks very similar out of both gimbals. When you have that stabilization in the lens or in the body of the camera working with that gimbal, you can get really good looking footage. Obviously, you're seeing some of that bouncing and bobbing going on. That's just me and my arm as I'm walking forward. If you want to get rid of that, you're going to have to invest in an arm and a vest, and it's a much bigger production at that point. So in conclusion, there's some things that I really love about the Weebill 2. I love that it has this briefcase handle and the stand that works both at the same time. I like the fact that for the plate, they actually use a standard 500 series plate. I love the color touchscreen, and I love that it moves off to the side so that you can always see it even when you have that briefcase handle attached. I love that it's a little bit smaller and easier to travel with than the RS2. But being that the battery life is so much worse than the RS2, and you can't replace the batteries, and of course the big one, the footage just simply isn't as smooth, even though it may be once you add in-camera stabilization and everything. It's just not as good for what it's supposed to be doing. I personally have to recommend the DJI RS2, even though it costs $200 more. I think this gimbal is just gonna grow with you a lot longer. I think it's gonna work for bigger cameras. I think it's going to work with different setups. For instance, if you're setting this up on a professional jib, or you wanna do some sort of car mount or something. The RS2 certainly isn't perfect, but it's definitely one of the best gimbals currently on the market.